My guest this week, Kathleen Conlon, has written numerous best-selling novels and short stories. One of her earliest novels, My Father's House, was made into a mini-series by Granada Television, and some of her other stories have been serialised on BBC Radio Women's Hour. Kathleen has had consistent success over the course of her career, and her short stories are now regularly featured in the fiction specials of Woman's Weekly. Kathleen joins us tonight as our studio guest on Arts Alive Books to discuss her new novel, Different Ways of Dancing, which is a World War I drama about the struggle of two women and the man they both love. Welcome to Arts Alive Books. And coming up later in the show, presenter Mike Bodner meets local author Brian Formby to learn how he wrote and published his first novel, Dark Side of the River. But first tonight, Kathleen Conlon. Kathleen, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And I understand you've got a bit of a cold, so I have to speak quite loudly for you.
Please, or I could use an ear trumpet, but I think that might be a bit excessive.
Now, I normally start off by asking people about their background and how they got into writing, so I don't see any reason to change the format. So can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Certainly. Well, very many writers say that they always knew they were going to write almost as soon as they could hold a pen. That was not the case with me. I was one of those children who drew pictures. And in fact, eventually I did a fine art degree. However, it dawned on me that my painting was becoming more narrative and that I might as well go back to the source and actually write rather than paint. And I think probably that's how I started.
Telling stories rather than
Yes,
providing images.
Yes, yeah.
So you started writing, was it straight into novels or did you start with short stories?
I wrote a novel. I was 21. It was about 300,000 words long. It was single-spaced and it was typed in red. And if there was anything more guaranteed to put off a potential publisher, I can't think what it might be. Anyway, it was sent off to Collins, and one very perspicacious editor must have seen some merit in it and called me to their offices and said that maybe if I went back and rewrote it, it could be publishable. Yeah. That's what I did.
So you cut the 300,000 words to 70,000 words.
Yes.
You used black ink instead of red ink and double spaced
Absolutely.
it.
Yeah.
And so you did go ahead and rewrite it?
I did.
And was that your first published novel?
It was, yes.
Which one was that?
It was called Apollo Summer Look, which the title is from a poem of Keats. I was a very literary young lady in those days, and it was very successful.
So you're living on Merseyside, presumably it's the 1960s, and things are getting quite exciting around the city. So you felt part of that in some respects?
Well, I'm not sure. I think writers are a race apart, really. I think we have to spend so much time alone and going into our own heads that perhaps, we don't join in the way that other media people do. It is essentially very solitary.
And has your practice changed over the years during which you've been writing?
I think publishing has changed beyond measure. In my early days, I found that publishers were very keen on encouraging talent and keeping their writers, whereas now it's accountant-led. So, if you don't make it first go, well, go and flip burgers at McDonald's kind of thing.
You're not cynical, Kathleen, are you?
Not at all, no. God forbid. It's much, much harder now, I think. Yes. Yeah. And also, it's become much more genre-led. You fit into a category. And if you don't fit into a category, it's much more difficult to get published. I mean, good writing is still out there, but you've only got to look at any table in a bookshop and see, outpourings of drivel.
Well, it's true. I mean, a lot of the people that we've been interviewing on the show over the last few months have been writing genre fiction. They've been writing detective fiction or fantasy fiction or adolescent fiction and so on. But I suppose you're right. I mean, good writing will still stand the test of time.
I think so, but as I said, I think you really have to persist to get it out there now. And I suppose hence the upsurge of electronic books and self-publishing. If that's the only way it can get to the public, then that's the way people choose to do it.
Yeah, and this kind of reflects on your latest book, doesn't it? Which is available in Kindle as opposed to being a hard copy edition.
Yeah.
How did you find that whole process?
Difficult, in a word. It's out there, it's on Kindle, it's on Google Play, it's on iTunes, but I don't think you can actually beat a book that is, you can get hold of. You can turn pages, you can look back, you can actually hold it and put it in your bookcase.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard not to be cynical, isn't it? This is one of your earlier books, Distant Relations, and would you prefer to see a carriage load of people on the train reading books or with their Kindles open?
Well, I would think if by default they're not going to be able to buy a hardback book or a paperback book, then I would rather they were reading, period. But given the choice, I would always go for the hard copy, always.
That's interesting. Well, can you tell us a little bit about your new book and what it's about?
Yeah, well, it had its genesis when I was searching to replace my father's First World War medals, which had been stolen. And the result of that was I did a lot of research into the First World War. And I thought, obviously, the effects upon the people involved were quite radical. And that's when I came up with the idea of having a family who were pretty much all involved in the conflict and how it affected them individually and together at the end of it all. I mean, it's a hugely fascinating period, and most of my research was done on the conflict on the Western Front, which was horrendous beyond belief. And I know now we are seeing so much more about it because of the centenary, and that was one of the reasons I decided that this was the time to publish the book.
Yeah, and so you talk about research. I mean, what kind of research did you do? Did you go into archives or the War Museum?
I went to the public records in Kew and bought every book I could find and, looked on the internet for details. And in fact, I suppose because my family were involved, I had an uncle who was shell-shocked and spent the rest of his time in an asylum. That war left its mark on everybody who was involved in it, either physically or mentally. And it was quite an eye-opener to me.
I suppose one of the interesting things about it is that it was so traumatic, but people didn't really have time to recover or to come to terms with it before another huge war was kind of foisted on the whole population. So then people never really had a chance to kind of come to terms with the fallout from that before they were kind of enmeshed in a new trauma.
I think there's a lovely line in an Alan Bennett play which is called Waiting for the Telegram, which Thora Hird is approaching 100 or something, and somebody asks her about the war, and they're talking about the Second World War, and she said, that's not the proper war. That's not, that was at a remove somehow, I think, the First World War I'm talking about, so its effect maybe was not experienced. Men didn't want to talk about what had happened to them, understandably so.
Yeah. And there has been a lot over the last year or so, hasn't there, since 2014 rolled around. But I think it's important that we continue to kind of market and to understand it. And
yes, I think I was a bit worried in case it might be overkill, people thinking, oh, no more of that. But it's very important to actually carry it on. Don't forget, it lasted 4 years. And, you know, it wasn't just, when you think about it, it was an armistice. It wasn't a victory or a defeat. It was an armistice.
It was exhaustion.
Quite, yeah.
So have you got any more projects lined up?
Well, I am, as you mentioned before, I think I now possibly lack the imaginative energy to embark on a novel. And I never thought I could write short stories because I thought they were a completely different genre, which demanded completely different talent. But I find now, maybe I've turned into Chekhov in my old age, and that's what I've been doing. And yeah, I'm enjoying that.
It's like learning to drive a different kind of vehicle, isn't
yes,
it? It's kind of similar in some ways. You're obviously trying to tell a story, but it is a real skill, and the masters of the genre are out there for us all to enjoy.
Quite. Chekhov, William Trevor, I mean, oh, so many. But most people start off writing short stories and then progress to the novel, and I did it the other way around, which is probably fairly symptomatic of my life.
I wonder, is that 300,000 word red script somewhere around?
Well, maybe, I don't know. Obviously, I learned from that experience. I never wrote at that length again. But a book dictates its own length. Certainly very few, you know, unless you're writing War and Peace, would require one to write that many words. But
Kathleen Conlon, thanks very much for coming in and joining us. Stay with us for part 2 when we meet local author Brian Formby. Many people dream of writing a novel, of having it published and becoming a best-selling author, which will garner us fame and fortune. But in our busy lives with so many distractions and responsibilities, where do you find the time to actually sit down and to write and, crucially, to persevere with a novel once you've started it? Reporter Mike Bodner met local author Brian Formby, who explains the struggles and the challenges and the processes of writing and getting his debut novel, The Dark Side of the River, completed and published.
Many of us have wanted to write a book, a novel maybe, something gripping that shoots straight to the top of the bestsellers charts and shoots us to fame and fortune. Unfortunately, not many of us manage to write it. There's never enough time, too many distractions, nowhere to write, friends are too critical. There's always reasons or excuses why not to write. Well, former Merseyside taxi driver Brian Formby is one person who has written a book and got it published. It's called Dark Side of the River. It's a gritty Depression era between the wars police drama set, as you might guess from the cover, in Liverpool. I asked Brian where he got the idea for the novel.
Well, I've always been fascinated by American noir, especially classic American noir, such as Maltese Falcon, The Big Sleep. All of Raymond Chandler's work I really love. And always having an ambition to be a writer, I decided to try my hand at a noir thriller. Only set in a city that I know and love. And it really, Liverpool really lends itself to the noir character, I think. And when I started writing, it just seemed to flow in a film-like way, seeing it in my mind's eye as a movie. And each sort of set piece of the book, of the story, seems to fit in so well with the city that in the end, the city itself became another character in the story, if you like. And I found as I moved around the city in my mind, parts of the story leapt out at me and drove me, if you like. So in many ways, the city itself drove the story and fitted in perfectly with the noir image.
Brian says he'd always wanted to be a writer, and by his own admission had bored all his friends to death telling them how much he wanted to be an author. So when he retired, he had no more excuses not to do it. Depression-era Liverpool, with its hardships, the rise of socialism, the hand-to-mouth existence that many people faced, lent itself as a backdrop for his story. Having a good idea for a story is one thing, but how do you actually get it started? How do you start writing on that very first blank page?
Being an uneducated writer, I just went by instinct. And I began the story. I had the characters, and I had the inspiration from certain points of Liverpool history. And I just went for it, basically. And I just mixed these up in this huge theatre of depressed Liverpool in the 1930s, and it just grew. Each it wasn't hard to do.
So it sounds a bit organic. Did you not map out the story first?
I didn't map the story out first. It was organic, very much so. But once I had down the first draft, then it became a process of structure and editing and elimination. And I don't think it's possible to sit down and write a novel straight off and that's it. You do have to go back and you see where you've tripped up, where characters have sort of not done what they should have done, or you've repeated yourself too many times. And it's also it's a growing process. I never thought I could read and reread and reread a book so many times. Initially, it was around about 150,000, 160,000 words, and I had to edit all that down.
Tell me about the discipline of writing. Did you have to manacle yourself to the PC every day?
Very much so, yeah. Initially, no, because I enjoyed the process so much. And once the first chapter was down, first draft was down, you tend to think, oh, I've done this now. Wow, this is fantastic. And then a month later, you'll read through and you think, oh, no. So that's when the discipline starts, because you think it's great, but really it isn't great. So you have to knuckle down and change and edit and improve and polish. And that's the really disciplined part.
And when you were writing, Brian, did you set yourself a number of words or a goal like that each day?
I set myself a number of hours a day. I would start work around about 9:30, work till about 1 or maybe 2. I found that was the limit of that was my threshold really of concentration. Some days were better than others, but generally I've set a time limit on my work.
Was there ever a point where you thought, this is just too hard, I'm going to give up?
There was a few points where I wanted to give up, because it's a lot to do with confidence. First book, a lot of the time I thought, why are you doing this? This is pathetic. It's absolute rubbish. You can't go on with this. And then I would leave it and go back to it, and I would think, well, that's not bad. That's not bad at all. Try this now, or try that. I think it's important to let other people read parts, but not to be too convinced by what they say, because if they're encouraging you, they're too gushing about the work, and if they're too critical, you just want to throw the whole thing in the bin. So you have to reach that fine balance in your own mind and have the confidence to know what you're doing is good. And that keeps you going, really.
Being a first-time author, Brian found it very hard to open the doors of the publishing houses. Even knocking on them drew very little response. So he had the idea of self-publishing and spoke to a couple of authors who themselves had successfully self-published and got some advice. Brian figured that if he could get his book published and looking like a proper book, he'd stand a better chance of attracting the attention of the big publishers and agents. But isn't self-publishing like cheating? Doesn't it mean anybody can write anything, publish it, and then call themselves an author?
Yes, there is a problem with people who just publish anything. I mean, there's just no feedback on what they do. They just publish. I chose a good publishing house, self-publishing house. They do want good work, and if I felt my work wasn't good enough to publish, I would never do it, because I have no ego. I'm not ego-driven that way. Some people can be. Some authors can be so self-confidence and have so much self-belief that even rubbish seems good. But I've never been like that. If I didn't feel my book was good enough to publish properly, then I wouldn't have done it.
Okay, so you've self-published, the book's arrived, you've got it in your hand for the very first time, it's your new baby. I can't really imagine what that must feel like.
It was amazing, really, especially the quality of the book. And what's really important about selling the book as well is the cover. And the quality of the cover, I think, just blew me away, because it says everything about the book, really. It puts it in period, it puts it in place, and it was just marvellous to hold it there, completely done, and I'm an author, but you know.
How successful has it been?
It's been very successful on Merseyside. It's sold very well. Waterstones Liverpool one have sort of adopted it in many ways, as have all the local independent bookshops. They've all been very, very supportive and very helpful. When I approached them initially with the book, I was very hesitant, but once they'd seen it and they looked through it, and they were very impressed, and it was selling really well in particularly in the independents, and the feedback they were getting from people was really good, and people were asking, when is the next one coming out? This is a bit of a cliffhanger on this book. We want to know what happens next, and that was really gratifying to get that.
So, somebody watching this now, Brian, might think, that's great, you know, I really admire what he's done, I might have a go at that myself. What advice would you have for them?
I would say, as far as self-publishing goes, if you're absolutely confident the book is high quality, go forward and self-publish. If you can't get a mainstream publisher or an agent, there's no stigma in self-publishing if your book is good enough. And also, you've got to be prepared to market and promote the book yourself. And even established authors have to do that. But for a self-published author, you have to have the drive and the confidence to push the book, to promote it, to go into bookshops. You know, it's very difficult, but you have to do that. But it's also part of the fun, actually, if you can take it.
Dark Side of the River is available now, and a sequel is currently in the works. If you have any comments or suggestions for the show, please do contact us at artsalivebooks@baytvliverpool.com. We look forward to hearing from you. See you on the next edition of Arts Alive Books.